Angie sat at her usual table at the bed and breakfast she sometimes called home. It's not, of course, really home to her because she's not exactly from around here. As an angelic being, she's only truly at home in a place that humans have tried for thousands of years to fathom. Some people have attempted to describe that reality, but their descriptions always fall light years short. Still, Angie was fascinated by the creatures around her, creatures that her celestial master loved so desperately. As she looked out from behind her sunglasses, she sometimes saw a faint resemblance to the one she served in the people who paraded past. But those images were often so cloaked or distorted that she sometimes found it hard to see the similarities. Still, Angie didn't judge them. That was not in her job description, and frankly, it wasn't in her nature. Still, she observed. Angie's people-watching, however, is quite different from ours. We only see what's before our eyes. When Angie's eyes follow an individual, she sees what we do, but she also sees the person's whole story at the same time. A crude way to describe it would be to compare it to watching a movie of the person's life played out in detail in the blink of an eye. Angie sees the things that made a person who and what they are today. Perhaps that's why angels don't judge character in the same way humans do. As Angie sat and sipped her coffee, she watched a woman across the street slowly shuffle down the block. The people around her have plenty of names for this kind of woman, none of them kind. In today's society, this woman fell easily into the broad category identified as the homeless, as if the homeless were some homogeneous group who just couldn't make it in normal society. Angie saw things a little differently. Her ability to see the whole story and to understand how this woman ended up in her particular predicament gave her a unique perspective. Many would call the woman Angie watched an addict. To be fair, they'd be right by certain definitions. There was no question that the woman had a chemical dependency. But she was no thrill seeker out for a good time. She wasn't a woman who sold her body to support her habit. She'd been a hard-working single mom who had done everything she could to provide for her daughter. She wasn't highly educated, but she was smart, industrious, and committed to doing what she could to keep a roof over their heads and food on the table. She'd worked 2 jobs and still managed to be there to help her daughter with schoolwork. Her daughter wasn't always dressed in the latest fashions, but her daughter and her daughter's clothes were always clean, and the girl was never late for school. Then came the accident. Molly was crossing the street one afternoon, rushing home from her day job to prepare dinner and help her daughter with homework. She was running a little late. Her boss had demanded that she stay late to clean up a work mess that wasn't of her own creation. And he did it just because he could, and he knew that she couldn't refuse. A tiny flame flared to life in Angie's eyes as she thought about that. It was why she wore sunglasses, so that bystanders couldn't see what was going on behind those lenses. With her unique abilities, Angie replayed the incident when Molly stepped off the sidewalk into a crosswalk in front of an oncoming car. Her ability to re-see the event was far more real than any video camera could capture. Molly replayed that same incident involuntarily on an endless loop because it had changed everything in her life. The pain from the accident was horrendous. Unfortunately, it didn't stop after she'd had surgery. Her recovery was long, arduous, and hurt like hell. Molly was religious about her physical therapy, but it was a long process that left her drained and in pain. If she'd been living alone, she could have struggled through and fought the discomfort into the night. But she had a young daughter who needed her to be there for meals and homework and simply to listen. The meds she took kept the pain at bay enough for her to function and focus on her daughter. It wasn't optimal, but it worked. Until one day, her doctor told her he couldn't prescribe any more of the painkillers. She'd maxed out her prescription. She'd done so by taking extra doses in order to enable her to cope with both her physical therapy and the challenges of raising a daughter by herself. Sure, she took the pills a bit more often than the prescription indicated, but what other choice did she have? A lot of single moms don't live in the best or safest neighborhoods. They simply can't afford it. Molly was no exception. One day, she was venting her frustration to her neighbor, Sylvia, who simply arched an eyebrow at her and said, "I know where you can get what you need without going back to your doctor." Sylvia explained that all Molly needed was to go to a certain address to pick up a prescription without seeing a doctor. Then she'd need to take it to a particular pharmacy where it would be fulfilled with no questions asked. Of course, everything was on a cash-only proposition, but it cut out all the paperwork and hassle and the waiting. Molly stared at Sylvia and timidly asked, "Is this all legal?" Sylvia smiled ruefully and said, "Honey, are you going to give up your chance for a little relief and a chance to help your daughter over some little legal detail?" Without another word, Molly asked for the addresses and jotted them down when Sylvia rattled them off. Molly shrugged off her legal and ethical questions and followed Sylvia's lead. Sure, it cost more than her prescriptions had before, but at least she had relief, without the worry or shame that came from telling her physician what was going on. And it enabled her to put her pain aside and concentrate on physical recovery and on her daughter. That worked for a while, until it became obvious to Molly that she didn't just need the pills to conquer the pain. She needed them simply to get by. She hated what she'd become. She knew that she was dependent on the pills, but didn't know how to stop the cycle. Molly wasn't the only one who caught Angie's eye as she sat and sipped her coffee. A few minutes after Molly had shuffled past, Angie cast her gaze on another figure making his way down the same street. Benny didn't have the same admirable qualities that Molly had. He was a loner with no close friends, and certainly nobody who was depending on him for help. What he did have was an addictive personality. He'd struggled with drug and alcohol abuse much of his life. It was almost as if someone had stamped addict on his DNA. He looked like a vagrant. He was ragged, and his hygiene wasn't exactly up to Emily Post's standards. But he hadn't always lived on the street. The truth was that he was actually a decorated U.S. Army soldier who had enlisted because he thought he could do some good. Like so many of his brothers and sisters in arms, he got a lot more than he bargained for when he shipped out. He saw things no human should have to see, and he saw the pointlessness of much of his activity, and even the questionable morality of some of what he did. On the one hand, it didn't dim his view of the mission, but it certainly made him ask a lot of questions. And, like too many of his brothers and sisters, he experienced trauma the human body and psyche are not prepared to deal with. He returned to his home shores with significant physical and psychological trauma that required treatment. His physical traumas were dealt with in the usual military way. His psychological trauma treatment was perfunctory at best. The scripts for his physical pain expired long before the pain subsided, and the images in his head often triggered sympathetic physical pain. And in the ever-efficient manner of the military, his pain meds were terminated according to a well-constructed plan, rather than according to his specific needs. Benny took a rather familiar path in treating his physical and psychological demons. Alcohol played a significant role in his coping strategy. Of course, it was never adequate. More often than not, he'd either lose control in an outburst of anger that came from who knows where, or he'd simply black out and wake up somewhere unfamiliar and uncomfortable. Certain prescription drugs, however, seemed to do more to calm his pain and his nerves. The only challenge lay in acquiring them. The VA was great for a while, but it had its limits and cut off service people when the rules said they should. It was a one-size-fits-all approach, but it worked for the VA, if not perfectly for the individuals under their care. There is, however, a kind of fraternity or sorority among military personnel. It's unofficial and unsanctioned, but there's no doubt that it exists. It's a fellowship that tries to look out for its own. And sometimes that includes finding medicinal help for wounded brothers and sisters. It wasn't hard for Benny to find that group, and it didn't take long for them to connect him to a place where he could get, quote, legitimate, unquote, prescriptions for the medicines he was sure he needed. Then he simply had to take the script to a specific address to get it filled. No questions asked, other than, where's the cash? For a while, it seemed like a good solution. Before too long, however, Benny realized that while he could dull his senses for a while, he couldn't survive without the pills that he swallowed with increasing frequency. It was expensive, too. His VA benefits didn't cover this kind of pain relief. So he took to the streets, asking for money from anyone who might take pity on him. And while it galled him at a certain level, he wasn't afraid to play the wounded vet card when he needed to. Groveling for sympathy made him sick. But then he knew he was already sick. Angie saw both Molly and Benny's stories in the blink of an eye. For her, it was almost like watching a documentary at supersonic speed. She caught every nuance and every detail. And while others shook their heads at the sorry state of these people, Angie had the full picture of who they were and how they had come to this point in life. And it angered her. Had anyone been able to see her eyes at that moment, they would have seen what appeared to be flames of fire reflected there. Once again, it was why Angie so often wore sunglasses in public, even on cloudy days. As an angelic being, Angie processed anger much differently than humans do. Her judgment remained unclouded. Her thinking process was unaffected. But if anyone passing by had been able to gaze into her eyes, they would have seen something akin to molten fire. Her eyes flashed in a way that would have frightened children and adults. No one could have gazed at those eyes without fear, because they looked as if they could set a forest ablaze. Among the details Angie gleaned from the stories of both individuals was the address of both the office that wrote the bogus prescription and the address of the pharmacy that fulfilled them. Given her unique set of skills, Angie didn't need a GPS or Google Maps to find the locations. She could have driven or taken a cab or an Uber to either location, but in her case, that simply wasn't necessary. She walked around the corner, stepped into an alleyway, and after checking to make sure nobody was watching, simply disappeared. If anyone had paid attention, they would have noticed that a woman with long dark hair, with a streak of red running through it, and deep dark eyes, suddenly walked out of an alleyway that moments ago had been devoid of human form. But this was the kind of neighborhood where people didn't pay attention to details like that. The best way to describe the area was nondescript. In fact, one wouldn't even call it a neighborhood. It looked more like a row of abandoned shop fronts. There were no signs in front of the few shops that were open. The empty stores weren't boarded up, they were just empty. An alley ran behind the buildings where deliveries were made. It was out of that alley that Angie stepped, unnoticed. She seemed to possess a confidence, or perhaps a purpose, that most people along the street lacked. People on that street, however, tended not to look at others. They kept their eyes down and went about their business with as little fuss as possible. Some went into the pawn shop on the corner. Others went into what used to be known as a dollar store before inflation reared its head again. And some kept their eyes down until they reached the door of Dr. Traumweber, MD. Once there, they opened the door to a medical practice unlike any they'd ever seen. To call it bare-boned was a kind exaggeration. It was clean enough and well organized, but it wasn't like any other physician's front office. There was no waiting room, just a couple of functional but uncomfortable looking chairs. There were no people filling out forms and waiting to see the doctor. There was simply a counter with a single person behind it asking to see, quote, the paperwork, unquote. Patients didn't linger long for conversations with the staff or the doctor. They simply gave their paperwork to the person at the counter who possessed all the social skills of a guppy. He then plugged the information into a computer and waited a few minutes for a reply. That's where the plastic chairs in the entry came in handy. The chairs didn't need to be comfortable. Nobody was there long enough to get comfortable anyway. Most people didn't even bother to sit down. Generally, after a 3-minute wait, the printer behind the counter spit out a script for the prescription the patient was there for. The person behind the counter would go through a door at the back and come out with a signature from Dr. Traumweber. The patient would then take the script and leave. Angie knew this because she sat in one of those uncomfortable plastic chairs for 30 minutes, watching the scene repeat itself. Angie didn't experience discomfort like mortals do. She was simply present, and she was observant. When there was finally a lull in the activity, the person behind the counter noticed Angie for the first time. At first, he was a bit taken back. She didn't look like most of the patients that came through the door. She didn't have the same air of desperation or resignation as the rest. And then there were those eyes. They were dark as coal, but he had the sense that they could instantly burst into flame. Can I help you, ma'am? He finally said. As Angie arose and approached the counter, the man behind the counter swore that he could see something that resembled embers in her eyes, glowing faintly. In a cool and utterly confident and commanding voice, Angie replied, "Yes, I'd like to see Dr. Traumweber now." To his own amazement, the man behind the counter heard himself reply, "Certainly, just one moment." At the same time, his brain screamed at him that nobody ever got to see Dr. Traumweber, and he braced himself to face the physician's wrath. Things went exactly as the front counter flunky anticipated. "What do you mean someone wants to see me?" exploded the doctor behind closed doors. "You know how this works. Nobody, and I mean nobody, gets to see me face to face." I know, doctor," muttered the counter lackey, "but I've never run into someone like this before. I don't know who she is, but it's like I can't say no to her." And then the worker bee melted before his employer and glanced back longingly to the comfort of his counter. "What in the world do I pay you for?" muttered the exasperated doctor. Seeing that he was making no headway with his employee, he finally said, "Get back to the counter and send this person in. But this is going to cost you, Armando." Armando returned to the counter and spoke words he had never spoken before. "The doctor will see you now." He then ushered Angie to the door of the doctor's office and silently slipped back to the safety of the counter as quickly as he could. Angie walked into the doctor's office and observed him behind his desk. His gaze never left his desktop as he stoically ignored her presence, obviously too busy and important to deal with such an interruption. Angie stood in silence. Time meant nothing to her, nor did the doctor's attempted intimidation. When one lives in eternity, a few minutes of time, whatever that was, had no significance. It mattered, however, to the physician behind the desk. "And how is it that I can help you?" droned the doctor in his best world-weary voice. "Is there some problem with your prescription? No, wait, I can tell that's not it. What exactly do you want from me?" After a long pause, Angie smiled coolly at him and said, "I'm not with the DEA. I'm not with the local police. I'm not even here as a representative from one of your competitors." Traumweber tried not to show his shock at these statements. "So why are you here?" he finally blurted out. "What do you want?" "What I want," returned Angie, "is of no importance. But you need to stop what you're doing, prescribing drugs to people who need to be receiving care instead of poison." "What the hell are you talking about?" retorted the physician. "Strange that you should mention hell, doctor," said Angie. "This is exactly the kind of activity that fuels the fires of hell. You were called to fulfill an oath to do no harm. You're acting in direct contradiction to the oath you swore." "Who the hell do you work for?" shouted the physician. Then he saw the fire ignite in Angie's eyes. I work for no one in hell, she said. And though her voice never rose, Traumweber felt as if he'd been slapped in the face. I serve but one master, and he is most displeased with what you are doing. Then she showed him, almost as if showing him a video, the lives of Molly and Benny, people enslaved to the drugs that he had prescribed. There was neither screen nor sound system, but it seemed to Traumweber as if he were observing the events in person. Although he'd never met Molly or Benny, he recognized them from the photos he'd seen of them in his files. The downward spiral of their lives played out like a fast-forward movie, and he grew increasingly unsettled. Still, he wasn't one to be intimidated, and he tried to put on an air of incredulity. "Wait a minute," exclaimed the doctor. "Are you trying to tell me that you're some kind of ambassador from God? Some kind of spokesperson for the Almighty? Give me a break, woman. I've dealt with some sick and deluded humans before, but you really take the cake." Angie stared at the doctor for a few seconds before responding, and saw the fear in his eyes. "Whether you accept my position or not doesn't matter a bit to me," she said, "but you need to take this warning seriously. If you don't, you will face serious consequences that you will regret for the rest of your life and beyond." Despite feeling cornered, the doctor shot back, "Is that some kind of threat? Are you saying that God is going to punish me for taking advantage of this situation?" "I do not threaten," came the angelic reply. "And I do not despise you or judge you. I simply see things that are and will be, and I came to warn you. I cannot influence you one way or another. I can only tell you about the impact your actions will have in ways you perhaps can't even imagine." And with that, Angie opened the door and stepped out, then quickly closed the door behind her. Traumweber rushed to the door and ripped it open after her, but she was gone. His front counter employee sat slumped in his chair. "Where's the woman who was just in my office?" demanded the physician. "Where'd she go?" "What are you talking about?" replied the obviously confused Armando. "Nobody left your office. Have you been taking some of the pills you're prescribing to those poor schmucks out on the street?" Traumweber stared at him for a few seconds before retreating to his office. He tried to gather his thoughts. "I don't know what just happened, but I am not going to let some religious whack job ruin what I've got going here. I'm not hurting anyone. I'm just filling a need in society. If I don't do it, some lowlife south of the border hombre is going to do it for less. That's just the way the world works." Next, a nocturnal visit from the angel.